Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in to this recorded show here on Friday morning. It should be a good one. It's kind of a transitional period right now for this show as we are going away from the realm of fantasy football and kind of previewing a little bit more fantasy sports talk to come in the future. Things like basketball, hockey, maybe soccer if you are fans of European football like myself. But for now, we're still a very football-heavy show for today, starting off with my picks for some pretty important Week 18 games. Maybe not the most important in terms of both teams playing for their playoff lives, but still a lot of interesting seeding implications in these games as well. We're talking about some fantasy winners and losers of the year at each position. That will be interesting to do. Then, I'm going to update you on some Super Bowl odds, see which teams look likely to hold the top spot for those odds heading into the postseason. Previewing that Sunday night football game between the first time ever two 14-plus win teams in the NFC North, the Vikings and Lions, for that number one seed in the NFC. And then concluding my first basketball segment in quite some time, updating you on the NBA MVP odds. Is it the Jokers to lose, or is new blood waiting to pounce and win this award? Without further ado, before we get into any of these segments, I do want to remind you, even though this is a recorded show, to like, follow, and subscribe to both the show and the network as well if you feel so inclined. Also, make yourselves available to the Super Chats, Super Things, Super Stickers features when this show is live. Contribute and interact a little bit more directly if you so choose. You can go to our website as well, gsmcpodcast.net, to leave any tips or donations or any questions, comments, or concerns you may have about the show. Just makes it that much better, way more fun when I'm being able to interact with you guys as well. Without further ado, let's jump right into our first segment, starting off with my picks for some big games. And like I said, although a lot of these have lost their luster, for example, there are a couple on this list where either both teams could have made the postseason, or one was going to make the postseason and, others are just one-off games and where it's win it in games. These games I still feel hold some importance for both the teams playing in them. Maybe one team is playing spoiler right now, or just playing for the future of their franchise like some of these teams are. But still, it should be an interesting week no matter the games I've chosen, and I still think there's a lot of chaos to come here in Week 18. So without further ado, let's jump right into the first game, starting off with a pretty bittersweet one for me. The Seattle Seahawks going up against the Los Angeles Rams. And while I know it's an easy pick, I wish it weren't, as I wish that the whole combination of teams that the Rams needed to win lost, thus allowing for this to be a NFC West win and you're in game for the division championship as well. But I am picking the Hawks because, unfortunately, the Rams are in and they're resting their starters. There might be a couple of seeding implications with that, where the Rams are foregoing the 3 seed, potentially allowing a team like Tampa Bay or Atlanta to hop over them and fall into the 4 seed, where they potentially would have to play, even though it's at home, a very hot Vikings team or a Detroit Lions offense who can score on anybody, which they don't want to happen. And even though this defense for the Rams have been playing well, I don't necessarily foresee a matchup against either of those teams going particularly well for them, especially on the offensive side of the ball, if they're facing a team like the Vikings who can really scheme up pressure on Matthew Stafford. But still, in this matchup, I'm picking the Hawks. The line might have moved a little bit from 2.5 in favor of Seattle once there was news of the Rams resting their starters for this one. But I do think this game is still important for Seattle, because it would mean that A, no matter who is on the field, they have at least beaten every single NFC West team. B, they've done it with a young head coach, in fact, the youngest head coach in the league, and a new one at that. And B, they've won 10 games in spite of a lot of deficiencies in talent in a very tough division. So kudos to Seattle, should they actually win this game, for beating every team in the NFC West and looking like the team that is well prepared for the future in that division as well, because time's going to be ticking on the 49ers. I don't necessarily think the Rams are as consistent as you would like them to be, and the Cardinals are still kind of in purgatory. So this could be an advantageous win for Seattle to kind of bolster their spirits for next season, while I believe they can compete for the NFC West title yet again. So that's why I'm picking the Hawks for a hopeful, optimistic future in that regard. Then a game that holds a little bit more importance as well. The Chiefs going up against the Broncos here. Broncos 9.5-point favorites at the time of this writing, my writing of this segment. Could have been a lot of hefty line movement there once the Chiefs decided to rest their stars, but still, Carson Wentz is a very competent backup quarterback. Yes, he may extend some plays too long, and he may risk the big play rather than taking what the defense gives him, but he's still a pretty competent backup quarterback, one of the better ones in the league. So I do feel like the Broncos will still have their hands full with them, but I still think that they are very comfortable with their cornerbacks in man coverage, Pat Surtain II and Riley Moss, covering these Chiefs receivers and really getting home on Carson Wentz. They blitzed at an all-time rate against Patrick Mahomes in that game a couple weeks ago and limited that offense to 16 points. So why not stop doing it against a guy like Carson Wentz? Because he is going to be a lot more risky with the football than Mahomes was. So that's why I feel like the Chiefs in this one are going to be up against it in terms of what passion the Broncos can bring in this game. And this is still the Kansas City Chiefs. So I'm going to pick them to cover, probably not to win outright. I still think the Broncos are going to play spoiler to the Bengals and Dolphins postseason hopes and ultimately make a lot of people mad that they're not going to be able to see an MVP caliber Joe Burrow in the postseason trying to play the villain. But still, I do think that the Broncos should have this one on lock just because I feel like Carson Wentz might be a little bit too mistake prone in this one instead of, just taking what the defense gives him, which could complement this offense pretty nicely in Mahomes' absence. So that's why I'm taking the Chiefs in this one to cover, but not to win outright. I think the Broncos will have just enough on the offense side of the football to win this one. But then let's get to the granddaddy of all granddaddy games here in the NFL on Sunday. The Sunday night football game, deservedly so, between the first time ever that two 14-plus win teams face off against each other in NFL history. And the weird thing is, they both lie in the same division. Vikings, Lions, 3-point favorites at home. This one is going to be a slugfest. I feel like both of these offenses are highly capable of scoring. I feel like the Vikings are going to take advantage of a depleted Lions defense, trying to attack the secondary as much as possible. Try and get wide bunch alignments for receivers like Jefferson and Addison to really stack up in one area of the field, create mismatches there. I wouldn't be surprised if Detroit plays some shell coverage to try and limit the explosives from Sam Darnold and try to clog the middle of the field. Whereas the Lions just got to get Goff in rhythm. They got to get Goff in rhythm against pressure, much like they did in that first game against the Vikings, where he had answers to the blitz repeatedly. And so that's what I think will help both of these teams in this game. That being said, I am picking the Vikings here. I just think the multiplicity of what they can do on offense, Kevin O'Connell's brilliant scheme in order to create simple plays for Sam Darnold in both the shotgun and play action, I feel like that will allow the Vikings to really settle into this game despite it being on the road and really take command here. I just think the Lions defense is a little bit too banged up, a little bit too shaky right now to really combat what the Vikings can do. So that's why we're going to go into this depth a little bit more of this game later in the show. That's why I think the Vikings are going to ultimately win this one outright against the spread. And last but not least, a game that, I was kind of intrigued by, early on in the Week 17 slate when I was looking at the Week 18 games and trying to decipher what playoff implications could stem from that, because the Commanders ultimately had a chance to miss the playoffs entirely had they lost these last two games. And this one against the Cowboys was one which Dallas did beat them before, but right now it's not as important. But it is still important in terms of seeding, because the Commanders could usurp the Packers for the number 6 seed with a win and a Packers loss, and the Packers in their stead could jump from 7 to 6 with a win and a Commanders loss. So look for this game to still have a little bit of implications, but not as much, because the Cowboys are just playing for pride here. But I do think that if the Cowboys win this game, it will mean a lot to the future of this franchise. Probably cement Mike McCarthy's status as their head coach next year. A lot of rumors and rumblings surrounding his status as potentially being on the hot seat. But I do think that the Commanders will win this game easily, cement their status as the number 6 seed, make for a very interesting game between either the Bucks or the Rams if they beat Seattle. So I do think that the Commanders will have this one on lock and will cap off an incredible rookie season. Oh, I think he should be rested for Jaden Daniels in this game, because ultimately I gotta shout out whenever someone, whether it be offensive coordinator or head coach, gives that much confidence to a rookie quarterback. We're going to see it in the postseason. I'm kind of previewing my second segment here when we talk about fantasy winners and losers, and I did spoil who my quarterback one was, but Jaden Daniels, remarkable season because of the fact that they just relied on him. Kudos to Cliff Kingsbury for creating a scheme that allowed him to really show off his multifaceted game plans. And I really think that the Commanders could be a surprise package come postseason time. I'm picking them to win in this game, even though they are resting starters, because I just think the Cowboys might want to pack it in and kind of focus on what went wrong this season outside of, the Dak injury and the contract extensions and the turmoil that could potentially created. But ultimately, I think the Commanders are going to cap off an 11-win season for the first time in quite some time, perhaps over 30 years. So kudos to them on that. But before we get into the second segment, I do want to remind you yet again to follow, and subscribe to the show on the network. Remember, once the show comes back to the live stream on January 6th, remember to make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way to contribute and interact with the show a little bit more directly. But other than that, we'll be heading into our first break. And right after that break, we're talking about some fantasy winners and losers of 2024.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our second segment of today's show, why not reminisce about the beauty of the 2024 fantasy football season, both the winners and the losers that really helped you either tank this season, or you can't necessarily tank at fantasy football, but have a pretty bad fantasy football season, or people who overperformed expectations really helped you take command in your fantasy league this year. And it was a great year, like I said. We saw a lot of breakthrough stars this year. We saw a lot of players who we thought were going to exceed expectations, ultimately come up short. But overall, it was a fun position to look at the quarterback position. We're going to start off with and then go down to the wide receiver position, because all of these position groups were so integral to helping you this season on your offensive front. Because ultimately, I love all the positions in fantasy, especially the defense and special teams, but these core positions were where we saw the most breakout talent as well. So without further ado, let us jump right into talking some fantasy winners and losers from this season. Starting off with the quarterback position, like I said, and we previewed this young man before in this first segment here on today's show, but Jaden Daniels was the ultimate winner of the season. Depending on how results pan out this weekend, he could end up being as high as the QB4 in fantasy this season, and that is highly impressive for a rookie. A paragon of consistency in his rookie season. So ultimately, I have to give all of his flowers to him, but ultimately to Cliff Kingsbury and Dan Quinn as well for settling him into this important big role coming into the league this year for a Washington Commanders team that needed a new identity. A lot of turmoil externally in the front office and things of that nature that really were threatening to carry over into this season and really kind of muddy what Jaden Daniels was coming into. But ultimately, new, fresh faces everywhere from the front office on down enters this organization and really made this now a healthy environment for a rookie quarterback to thrive in. And thus, Jaden Daniels did ultimately see that success. Kudos to him. Kudos to everyone concerned, especially in that offensive group here with Cliff Kingsbury and all those other coaches helping him, guide him into this transition from college to the NFL with such a college-friendly scheme that ultimately we haven't really seen in the NFL to date like this, that ultimately really helped him to settle in and become one of the better rookie quarterbacks of the last few years, and kind of making us all forget about CJ Stroud last year as well. And then I also had to give an honorable mention to Mr. Sam Darnold. What an incredible season for him. Second only to a former teammate of his, Baker Mayfield. How fun would that be if the Vikings ended up playing the Bucks and those two former teammates go at it? But still, second only in touchdowns to Baker Mayfield this season. Just incredible. Kudos to Kevin O'Connell. Another great coaching job here. Really scheming things up for him offensively that makes him comfortable. Takes advantage of his accuracy and arm strength. Ultimately settling him into this new team after the loss of J.D. McCarthy this season. Potentially also cementing his status as their QB1 next season. But whether or not he remains a QB1 in Minnesota or goes somewhere else, look for Sam Darnold to continue this success that he found in a new home in Minnesota this season, with a new team or with Minnesota this season, because they should be lucky to have him. Because this season could have been a disaster. A lot of people were writing them off as soon as J.J. McCarthy went down. But Sam Darnold really stepped up to the plate, really adapted to Kevin O'Connell's scheme, and ultimately found a lot of success. And they are one win away from being the NFC's number one seed. So we had to shout him out. But Jaden Daniels takes the cake here as a rookie quarterback for a once floundering organization, leading them to new heights. Now at the loser side of things, this is a guy who ultimately a lot of people might have been hoping to see more out of this season, but came up a little bit short. How about Trevor Lawrence? Coming off a big contract extension, over $60 million, I believe. A lot of people thought that in his third season in the NFL for Jacksonville, he would turn a corner. This was ultimately the season where Doug Peterson would really start to show his prowess as a head coach and ultimately get more multifaceted in the offensive side of the football. They brought in Brian Thomas to the draft to ultimately help Trevor Lawrence lean into something he loves, which is his deep ball, but ultimately he came up a bit short. Not just a bit short, a lot short. This is still a quarterback who I think has all the raw talent to succeed in the NFL, but nothing seems to be working. No coaching plan has been implemented that gets him comfortable. They're going to have to try and find a head coach now that really can buy into him. But ultimately, they're going to have to pick up a lot of pieces here, not just internally and externally, to get Trevor Lawrence back to his best. Because I don't necessarily believe that a lot of fantasy managers will be in on him next season because of what happened this year. So that's why he lies firmly in the loser camp for now. But I still think that he has his whole NFL career in front of him. This was only his third year, remember. So he has a lot of room to improve, but I do think that if they find the right head coach, he can improve as rapidly as some other young quarterbacks around the league as well. But that concludes the quarterback portion of this segment. Now let's get into the running back, because this one is a little bit more exciting because there was so much talent and depth at the running back position this year. Maybe not at the top where, it's still Saquon, Derrick Henry, and even though he missed half the season, people still probably consider Christian McCaffrey to be a top-level running back as well. But still, this season brought a lot of surprises at the position as well. None less than Bucky Irving, a huge winner here. A waiver wire gem found in the middle of the season when the Bucs really were discovering what they can do with the run game. Rachaad White kind of disappointing early on in the season, so they turned to Bucky Irving, the young rookie, and he really made the job his own. I believe he has 1,000 yards from scrimmage, so kudos to him. Kudos to the Bucs offensive line for really helping this running game, which I thought was going to be a little bit of an issue coming into the season for the Bucs as they try to make a more balanced offense around Baker Mayfield and those weapons in Mike Evans, the injured Chris Godwin now, and a guy like Cade Otton, who was also a rookie and came into his own this year. So kudos to Bucky Irving and this Bucs offense, especially Liam Cohen, for creating multifaceted ways in which this offense can score, and to Bucky Irving most especially for taking advantage of that in return, because they really did need a running back who really could solidify the position, really could create explosive plays, not just in the pass game, but the run game, and that's what he did, and he took control of that. And look for him to continue to improve, be a steady 10 to 20 point performer for you at the running back position, potentially a better option than flex next year, because we have to see if he has a sophomore slump, but I still believe in him as well. Whereas this guy really did kind of see a slump in form after another move to another team, DeAndre Swift. This guy has moved around a lot, but no matter where he's gone, he's usually been one of the better kind of quote-unquote depth running backs from a fantasy perspective. I've used him a lot in fantasy this year. Really looking forward to what we would do for Chicago. Kind of like the balancer, the ultimate balancer of this offense, but he failed miserably. And I think this guy, Swift, is someone who, because he hasn't necessarily found a home, really has a lot of challenges trying to adapt to different offensive schemes and styles. And this one just didn't work in Chicago. I really had no idea what the Bears' identity through the running game was, because I don't necessarily think they trusted it too much. And because of that, DeAndre Swift kind of declined to his early Lions days, where he didn't necessarily have the confidence to make certain decisions in the run game that really helped him become this very multifaceted running back when he moved to Philly. But now in Chicago, I don't necessarily know what his role is, and his future is going to be looking very uncertain this offseason if they make some personnel decisions there. So this season was an ultimate bust, and unfortunately, I do think that's the reason why I collapsed in fantasy, because I did not have a strong running game to supplement a guy in James Cook who I really liked. So that's the reason why I think DeAndre Swift was such a loser this year, and I had to include him on this roster. Now at the wide receiver position to conclude. I think the wide receiver position, you certainly could have had a lot of options for the winner here, because, a lot of guys who you expect to have superstar level seasons ultimately did, and they also did it in kind of challenging situations, whether it be the new quarterback with Justin Jefferson or reduced role with Amon-Ra St. Brown. But I still have to award another commander here in Terry McLaurin, finally getting his quarterback, throwing him the football, and ultimately showing that he truly is someone who could be considered to be, at the very least, a top 10 wide receiver in this football league. Because I do believe that a lot of people really loved him from a fantasy perspective, but didn't necessarily feel like the quarterback play would bolster his stat lines and his fantasy production in turn. Ultimately, Terry McLaurin has proved this season that he is a steady, solid presence for you in fantasy. And if this connection between him and Daniels continues to grow, look for him potentially move into the top 5 ranks next season from a fantasy perspective. The sky's the limit for this duo, and I'm really excited to see the future of what Terry McLaurin and Jaden Daniels do as well, because this offense can really, really blossom and become one of the NFL's toughest to defend should this duo continue their ascension through the ranks of the league. But then in the loser, this was tough because I really think this guy went above and beyond for this team this season in a situation that was really rough for him, despite all those offensive deficiencies, despite all those different quarterbacks. This guy really stepped into his zone. But when you consider what he means to the franchise, this certainly feels like a wasted season for Mr. Malik Nabers. And that's what it stems down, because he had a remarkable season for the situation he was put into. 1,000 yards with 3 different quarterbacks and a horrid offensive line, ultimately getting so many targets just because he was their best player. But I do feel like where this loser, well, quote-unquote loser status comes into play, but because of the way it feels wasted, because a lot of people are thankful that Malik Nabers turned a bleak situation positive from a fantasy perspective, but in real life as well. I do feel like Malik Nabers' confidence might be getting a little shot. They might not even get their quarterback of the future because of the win last week, dropping them from the number 1 pick in this 2025 NFL draft. So I do feel hard done by for Malik Nabers just because of the fact that the Giants find so many different ways to screw everything up, and now they're in a position where it's not looking like they're going to get the quarterback of the future, and they might be miring in mediocrity for yet another season. So that's why I feel like Malik Nabers feels like a fantasy loser, because it's mainly for the future instead of now. But that future is looking a little bit more bleak. But that'll just about do it for this segment. Coming up for our third segment of the day, going to be updating you on some Super Bowl odds, who heading into the postseason coming up in a couple weeks will be the Super Bowl favorite. Find out right after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of the day, and we updating you all on the Super Bowl odds before Week 18 and before we get into the postseason, before everything's all decided. Remember, all of these kind of projections and Vegas projections as well were written well before today, so remember that these could be ever changing, and I don't necessarily like this top 5 as much as I thought I would coming into this show, but ultimately this is the top 5 we have for today. So without further ado, let's jump right into it, starting off with the 5th place team based off of Vegas's odds that I found, the Baltimore Ravens. And I really like this football team at plus 750 as a not necessarily a dark horse contender, because everyone really likes this Baltimore team and likes what Lamar Jackson has been doing. But I do feel like the reason why they're a dark horse contender this year is because of that defensive decline. They still have a lot of elite talent. Madubuike, Marlon Humphrey in the secondary. But it just needs to come together, because there are so many more ways to attack this Ravens secondary, because they don't necessarily trust the back end as much. And this linebacker core lost a lot of its depth last year. They lost Patrick Queen. They lost Roquan. Well, they have Roquan Smith, but ultimately he hasn't necessarily been the same as Patrick Queen was last year. They still had Madubuike, and he still had a decent year being named to the Pro Bowl, but still, I do feel like this Baltimore Ravens defense might let it down. This offense may have to make every game a shootout where Lamar Jackson is completely on his game and Derrick Henry adds a nice balance to keep possession of the football for as long as possible for them to really try and run through this gauntlet that is the AFC. That's why they kind of sit at the 5th position, not necessarily breaking into the upper echelon of teams here. So that's why I feel like this Baltimore Ravens team is hard done by the Vegas odds, but kind of in a way that makes a little sense based off of what we've seen defensively from them. If they put it all together, then by all means necessary, this could be a Super Bowl team, because Lamar Jackson is playing at an MVP caliber level, and I love what Derrick Henry has been for this offense, even after I said I was a little bit skeptical about that move. But ultimately, it's going to come down to the complementary football here. Because if the defense complements this offense, then this could be a unit that's clicking. But I haven't seen it thus far consistently. So that's why I sit at number 5 in Vegas and in my mind as well. Then number 4, a team that definitely looking like one of the hottest in the league, prove they can go 3 deep at quarterback in their win against the Cowboys. Maybe not wanting to rely on that as much, want all of their quarterbacks as healthy as possible for this postseason push. But the Philadelphia Eagles certainly feel like a very deep football team. I really love what I'm seeing from Philly, the multiplicity of this offense, what Saquon Barkley means to this offense. Ultimately, not going to be able to go for the record. They're going to be resting him for the postseason run. But ultimately, still a team that I feel puts it all together on the football field. Complementary defense, multifaceted offense. But ultimately, where I do see deficiency is in the pass game. And I'm not saying that Jalen Hurts is a bad passer of the football, but ultimately they don't rely on it too much to where Jalen Hurts can develop into a rhythm. They really rely on Saquon almost a little bit too much in terms of what they do moving the football. And I do think that it is a positive in some regards, because running the football means you retain the football, keep opposing offenses off the field. And if you're in the NFC, that's going to matter a lot, because all of these offenses are capable of scoring 30 to 40 points per game. And so if you're Philly and you know that you're relying on a guy like Saquon a lot, it makes sense to rest him and ultimately to make sure that his role is as important as not just making explosive plays, but also retaining the football, because that's what Philly can do better than anyone, in my opinion, in the NFC field. But ultimately, Jalen Hurts is going to be asked to pass a little bit more come postseason time. And if he isn't prepared for that, prepared to carry that load, that's where I can see the Eagles season hitting some roadblocks. Yes, there are some defenses that you feel you can take advantage of in the pass game, the Lions notwithstanding. But ultimately, I do feel like Philly is going to have to rely on complementing this run game. And it starts with Jalen Hurts taking up a bigger role come postseason time in this offense. And I do believe that he can be ready for it. We've seen that he can make certain throws, but ultimately, we've also seen some uncomfortable moments from him this season as well. So that's why I kind of have my trepidations about Philly, but they are playing fantastic football. And you can say they're playing the best football in the NFC down the stretch. But I still have to see every single cog in the machine click, because Jalen Hurts really needs to develop that rhythm, like I said, in order for this run to bear fruit here, because I do think that they are a true Super Bowl contender, deserving of being in the top 5. And that's why I feel like any team from the NFC can compete. But the Eagles, because of what we've seen from them repeatedly, relying on Saquon, give me a little bit of trepidation in terms of a postseason stretch, rather than using him all regular season, because of the fact that you need to pass to win sometimes come postseason time. So that's my only caveat with this plus 600 Philadelphia Eagles team. Then number 3, this is a team that I really think a lot of people are getting on the hype train for. And I do think that it could seemingly be their year. They just have to play their brand of football, and ultimately, they should be fine. The Buffalo Bills should be fine. At plus 450, I do feel like Josh Allen and this offense are looking like the best they've ever been in this era for Josh Allen. Joe Brady doing a remarkable job with this offense, really kind of moving past the tension that a guy like Stephon Diggs created there, and really looking at ways to A, make Josh Allen look good still, and B, limit the turnovers, because that was a big problem the past couple of seasons in Buffalo. My only caveat here as well is the defense. Yes, they look pretty good against the Jets, but they're the Jets this season, and the Jets this season do not look that good. So I do feel like this defense needs to prove against playoff caliber offenses that they're willing and able to complement this Buffalo offense, because the Buffalo offense really is clicking on all fronts here. Yes, they've had some questionable games, and yes, Josh Allen can put up the occasional stinker, but ultimately he's playing an MVP caliber level, and in order to not waste this season, that defense really needs to be the difference in the postseason. They're going to be facing teams like the Ravens potentially. They'll be facing a Chiefs offense that we know can get hot come playoff time. So they need to be primed and ready to go on the defensive side of the football to prepare for the multiplicity of these offenses. And I do think they have the depth and talent there, but it's all going to come down to how they plan week in, week out for these these offenses, because that's going to be the key. That's always going to be the key in the NFL. Defense is what wins games. And as much as I think this Buffalo offense can put up as many points as possible in order to ensure they win football games, I still think that this defense is going to be under heavy scrutiny. And that's why I feel like a lot of people might have apprehension placing their bets on this Buffalo Bills team, even though I still think they have all to play for. And it certainly seems like at some point you feel they're going to break through, especially in this year when the Chiefs are looking a little bit more vulnerable than usual, and there really isn't necessarily a quote-unquote top team in the AFC I can point to. So Buffalo had to take advantage of that, but they're going to have to play complementary football along the way. Then at number 2, let's talk about those aforementioned Kansas City Chiefs, because at plus 450 at number 2 overall on this list, a lot of people might be a little skeptical about that. But they've earned the number 1 seed. They're a 15-1 football team looking to go 16-1 in a regular season. They have one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL in number 15. They have one of the best defensive coordinators, especially come postseason time, in Steve Spagnuolo. They have weapons that they feel can grow into the postseason. Travis Kelce, yes, he's been showing signs of age, but he's been one of the best postseason performers of all time. Xavier Worthy, a very multifaceted talent who, if they utilize his speed correctly, could be a huge weapon. DeAndre Hopkins, one of the NFL's most underrated receivers over these past couple of years, over this past decade, whether it be in Houston to Tennessee to now. So, you feel that even though they haven't been the most convincing 15-1 football team by a long shot, this team is going to catch fire come postseason. But I do feel like in order for that to happen, in order for the three-peat to really become possible, this Chiefs team can't get in its own way. What I mean by that is they have to start thinking about just treating this postseason like any other postseason. Because if they let talks of three-peat get to them, that's where I kind of feel like they'll get caught up in the moment. Now, I do feel that Andy Reid and his coaching staff has done a great job to combat that, to kind of ease them into this postseason. And they've earned this kind of quote-unquote week in bye week where they're resting all their starters and preparing them for this grueling postseason run. But I do feel like when you're a team on the precipice of history, those thoughts can begin to seep in. And that's where self-doubt can be created. And it may not be something that shows on the football field, but externally there's going to be a lot of noise. So if the Chiefs can handle that well, what they've done in this dynastic run so far, then they should be fine. But I still think that in this very muddy AFC, there are opportunities for other teams to potentially get them on a bad day. Whereas before, the Chiefs just through magic by hook or by crook got the job done. Now it just feels like there are certain teams waiting to pounce. And so that's why I feel like the Chiefs just need to play within themselves in order to truly combat all of that. But I still think they're a viable second contender here, but not necessarily a number 1 contender, because this Detroit Lions team feels like a team of destiny no matter how many injuries they have. And so that's why I think that this is an apt number 1. Maybe not a number 1 that a lot of people will be feeling confident in now, because they could be looking at the 5 seed and going on the road to face a very tough Bucs team that has beaten them this season, or a Rams team that has a defense that can pressure Jared Goff like all hell. But ultimately, I do feel like this Detroit Lions team can find a path to the Super Bowl. And it's through outscoring every opponent they will face. Because this offense under Ben Johnson has been one of the most creative, unique offenses in the NFL. And they found balance this season, unlike anything I've ever seen before out of them. Because not only have they utilized this wide receiver core to the best of its abilities, using the multiplicity of someone like an Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jameson Williams, but they also really leaned heavily into the run game as well. And while David Montgomery's out for the season, Jahmyr Gibbs is more than capable of carrying the load there as well. So this is a multi-talented team on the other side of the football. The defense, yes, going to have to step up, especially in the secondary, because that's where a lot of their strengths still lie. They still have Brian Branch healthy. They still have Kirby Joseph healthy. They still have Melifonwu. They still have Tarian Arnold healthy. That's where they need to rely on the depth of that secondary to come through for them. But ultimately, I still think they should be primed and prepared for a deep playoff run as well. So that's why I feel they remain number one, and they just need to lean into this offense, because this offense can put up points on anyone and force anyone to play catch-up in the NFC. And that's why I still feel like the Lions are viable options. But let me know what you think. Potentially in next week's comments about these updated Super Bowl odds. But coming up next, we'll be talking about an important match between these Detroit Lions and the Minnesota Vikings for the NFC number 1 seed on Sunday Night Football. Should be a good game. We'll be right back to talk about it after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts.
Hello everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And for our fourth segment of today's show, we're going to be previewing, like I said before, the Sunday Night Football game between the Vikings and Lions, first ever meeting of two 14-plus win teams in NFL history. And what do you know, they're in the same division, playing not just for the NFC North title, but the overall number 1 seed that comes with the caveat of home field advantage. And this one should be an incredible match between two teams that feel that they know each other's number. In the last meeting, all it took to separate these two teams was a Jake Bates last-minute field goal. So I do feel that this next game, this last game of the entire NFL season, is going to prove to be one of a very thrilling game in 2025 here in the NFL that really will usher in the postseason very nicely. And I do feel, though, that the loser of this game, though, is not going to feel that hard done by. Even though they're going to have to go on the road in their first round matchup, they feel like they will have enough for a deep playoff run. In which the Vikings, they feel like they can rely on their defense to continue playing well and really carry the load should Sam Darnold start to struggle come postseason time. And as the Lions, they feel they can just outscore anybody. And, you know, if it's come down to either the Bucs, the Falcons, or the Rams, who the number 5 has to play, I feel like the Vikings or Lions will be heavily favored in that matchup, even though I like 2 out of those 3 teams really to try and make a game out of it against these two squads. But the game in question for this Sunday night game is Vikings-Lions. Let's focus on that from a betting perspective. Detroit 3-point favorites, over under 52.5. Minnesota plus 175. Detroit minus 145. So as you can see, people in Vegas still confident in terms of Detroit's look for this game. But I still think it's going to come down to the competitive nature of both of these squads. Now let's look at the Vikings in this matchup first and foremost, because they're the team that I feel like is coming into this playing with house money. Because they, even though they're the road team, even though I feel like they're the team a lot of people are expecting to look a little bit mortal in this one in terms of how Detroit's going to attack them, I still think they've had the better season. I still think they could have a deep playoff run. All things are possible for the Vikings come postseason. And so I have to look at this coaching staff, with Kevin O'Connell, with Brian Flores on the defensive end, really helping this team become a vaunted juggernaut in the NFC. One-score game monsters. They know how to close out the close ones, and that's going to come and play in the postseason. And ultimately, the way they utilize their wide receivers is one of the most impressive in all of football. Sam Darnold really has looked comfortable, but you have to give all the credit to Kevin O'Connell for really creating a scheme that fits his best strength. Because remember, Sam Darnold still has all the strengths that made him attractive in that draft a couple of years ago. Wow. Not just a couple years ago, but over 6 years ago in 2018. It just feels like yesterday, the way Sam Darnold has been playing. But ultimately, Sam Darnold just has to relax into Kevin O'Connell's system and play with the freedom we know how. And ultimately, that's what makes the Vikings so good. And I think in this matchup, they have the unique advantage where they can create overloads in certain parts of the field in terms of wide receiver alignment, bunching them up, creating opportunities in the middle of the field where Sam Darnold thrives, and putting pressure on this Detroit secondary. I wouldn't be surprised, like I said earlier in one of my first segments, if Detroit tries to play shell coverage, leave the too high up there in terms of safeties. But I do feel like the Vikings just have answers for that because of the multi-talented wide receiver core they have at their disposal. And TJ Hawkinson is also a huge maker and might be the X factor in this matchup as well, and in their postseason run as well, because he loves dwelling in the middle of the field. And while Detroit might want to play a little bit more man coverage in this one rather than trying to, just allow Minnesota to win the time possession battle with zone, I do feel like TJ Hawkinson, especially on third and long situations, second and long situations, could be a vital option for Sam Darnold in the past game. Not just in this one, but in the postseason as well. Because he just opens a lot of opportunities up for himself and for the receivers on this Minnesota Vikings roster. That's where I stand with Minnesota in this game. Now looking at Detroit, and I feel like Detroit is a team not just built around their play, it's built around their culture, built around their vibe, it's built around what Dan Campbell preaches in terms of identity, and it's really flowing over into their play. I feel like they're becoming a lot more confident in this roster as they go along. I ultimately feel like, even though they had to battle with injuries, 19 injuries in their defense, lay an injury reserve right now. They have a couple injuries on offense as well. David Montgomery is going to be a huge loss come postseason time, but they've done a fantastic job compensating for it. Yes, that game against San Fran may have been a little bit too revealing ahead of this important matchup where San Fran really put a hammering on that defensive line. But ultimately, I do feel like if the Detroit Lions are scoring like we know they can, they have the offensive talent to really force you to play catch-up to them. And I feel like they can win any shootout they're in. And I'm not saying this game could potentially be a shootout. And I do feel like the Vikings may just have the upper hand defensively here. But I do think that Jared Goff and this offense can create mismatches here and can get him into a rhythm should the Vikings continue with their heavy blitz rate in this one, like I said. Because that's what I feel like Brian Flores is going to want to do. He's going to want to force Jared Goff to make quick decisions, and Jared Goff was highly impressive in their first go-around. I believe it was 14 of 16 for 100-plus yards and a touchdown against the blitz in that game. So he was very efficient, and that's what makes Jared Goff such an appealing option for the Detroit Lions going forward in the postseason as someone to completely hand the keys to the car over in terms of what they can do offensively. Because if Jahmyr Gibbs is getting pushed around a little in the run game, which I can foresee potentially in the postseason against these tough physical run defenses, I feel like Jared Goff has learned how to adapt to the pressure. That was one thing that I felt led to their downfall in the NFC Championship game last year, especially on those critical fourth downs, because Goff couldn't handle the heavy pressure on him. And so, if Jared Goff can continuously repeat getting into rhythm, maintaining his efficiency on those blitz plays, then I can foresee a game in which Detroit, not just here, but in the postseason, can win through his efficiency. And that's why I think the Lions are always going to be in any game going forward against any team with a talented defense. But then again, looking at how both of these teams can match up with each other defensively, I just feel that the Vikings have a little bit more multiplicity in how they can attack. Because I'm looking at guys like Jonathan Greenard off the edge. I'm looking at guys like Andrew Van Ginkel at the linebacker position. I'm looking at the depth of their secondary. I'm looking at guys like Cam Bynum, Josh Metellus, who can force turnovers in terms of leading the league in turnovers, leading the league in interceptions. I feel like this defense just has so much talent at every single phase, whether it be from their line to their secondary, that Detroit's going to really have to be on their game a week after an emotional win over San Fran. On a shorter week than Minnesota, mind you. So that's where my mindset in terms of predictions for this game lays. Because if the Lions want to turn this game into a shootout, which they very well can, better than anyone in the league, they're going to have to rely on protecting the football. And I just feel like at some point in this game, Jared Goff's going to crack a little bit more than usual. And so that's where the Vikings love to pounce. If they can create short fields for Sam Darnold, if they can get him into a rhythm off those short fields and put up as much points as they can against the Detroit Lions offense that's never out of a football game, then the sky's the limit for them in this one. I feel like they ultimately hold all the power here. They ultimately have the advantage defensively. They can create mismatches unlike anyone against Detroit offensively. And thus, that leads me to believe that they might actually have the advantage here in terms of covering the spread and potentially winning outright. But I do have to give the benefit of the doubt here to Detroit as well. Even though I am picking the Vikings, I have to kind of give Detroit their flowers, because this is a team that's gotten to 14 wins no matter what. They just refuse to say die. Dan Campbell has created an incredible identity and culture there. And no matter if they're the 1 seed or the 5 seed, they're going to go into the playoffs with a lot of hope and optimism, no matter what befalls them. And I feel like, a lot of pressure is riding on them to ultimately win the Super Bowl this year. Dan Campbell said as much himself. We may not get another opportunity like this. And so that's why I feel Detroit can, even in a loss, prove that they are battle-tested and ready for whatever stands in their way. They're going to be on the road if they lose this game, but I still think that nobody will want to face a tough Lions team coming off only their 3rd loss this season. Whereas for the Vikings, it might prove to be a little bit more of a difficult path, because the Bucs and Rams really match up pretty well with the Vikings when I look at them both offensively and defensively. I really feel like both of those teams, especially, can create a mismatch where the Vikings are going to have to be forced to play their game. The Bucs can move fast and loose. Baker Mayfield certainly loves taking a lot of risks, loves playing with a lot of passion and moxie and fire. And then if you're the Rams, you have a defense that can really match up pretty well against this Vikings offense, even though it's a young one at that. But I still think that the Vikings shouldn't necessarily be too worried, because they feel that they can win those matchups with creativity on the offensive side of the football through Kevin O'Connell, and through the defensive side of the football through Brian Flores. For those two coaches, I feel like Minnesota can rely on game plans that ultimately bring out the best in their team week in, week out. So ultimately, it doesn't really matter who wins or loses this game, in my humble opinion. All things are possible for either of these teams, win or lose. But when I just look at this game from a face value, the two teams that are going to be playing on the field, outside of the noise of the NFC, I just think that in this matchup, the Detroit Lions are going to be a little bit too within themselves, coming off of that emotional, like I said, game against San Fran, where they were really put to the sword and really deployed a lot of energy in that game, most importantly. Making a kind of cross-country trip, back to Detroit to face a Minnesota Vikings team that really has been stacking up impressive win after impressive win, none more impressive than beating the Green Bay Packers for the second time this season. So I just think that the Minnesota Vikings are a little bit more prepared, a little bit more ready, a little bit more hungry, most importantly, in this game, because they feel like they can get the Lions. They were this close to getting the Lions a couple weeks ago. And now it just feels like their time to take advantage of that and really, really take command of the NFC playoff picture. Because if they do, I don't necessarily feel like anyone will want to go into a raucous U.S. Bank Stadium come postseason time. And I feel like the Detroit Lions won't care. But still, it is going to create a little bit of a mental block if they lose this game. Because they won't be at home for quite some time, potentially, in the postseason, or at all, if at that, in the postseason, if they don't get this right. So that's why I'm a little bit concerned about Detroit should they lose. But ultimately, neither of these teams should feel hard done by, win or lose. It's just for NFC North pride at that, and you have all things in front of you in the postseason. But let me know what you think come next week in the comments. But for our final segment, for the first time in quite some time, we'll be talking some basketball, updating you on the NBA MVP race right after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back to the final segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And for our final segment, we're what seems like a long time coming here on the show. We're going to be talking some basketball. I'm going to be updating you on the NBA MVP race. Is it firmly the Joker's to lose? Playing the best basketball of his career, or will some new blood usurp him this season? A lot of good candidates from 5 to 1 here. Yes, Nikola Jokic has a firm stranglehold on that number one position thus far, but let's talk about some certain players here from 5 to 1 that could potentially usurp him. Without further ado, let's talk some basketball, shall we, after what feels like forever in terms of when we last talked about it. So let's start off at the number 5, one of my favorite players in the NBA from my favorite team in the NBA, Jason Tatum with 25 to 1 odds, 28.8, 9.3, 5.7, 46.3% in the field. Bear in mind these stats were written a couple weeks ago, so ultimately Jason Tatum has been potentially outperforming these expectations, potentially coming a little bit under these stat lines that I'm talking about right now, but still kind of around the same area in terms of when I wrote these last week. So not necessarily too many changes in any of these stat lines, drastic ones at that. But I do think that Jason Tatum really has stepped up as the number one option for Boston. Kind of a little bit ahead of Jaylen Brown in that regard, but still, in terms of this team mentality for Boston, starting to become a little bit more of a number one option. But that certainly is the caveat there with a guy like Jason Tatum playing in this team environment. how do you create an opportunity for yourself to become the league's most valuable player when it seemingly feels like almost everyone on your team is a valuable player? Because you have so much depth. You have Derek White. You have Peyton Pritchard playing at an incredible level. You have Sam Hauser coming off the bench. You have everyone, despite all the injuries you've struggled with throughout the season as well. Chris Stapps, remember, still hasn't played that many games this season. Jaylen Brown's been dealing with a couple injuries. And you still have to use a lot of rotational depth, and they're playing at a high level. And this team mentality is still being implemented. I don't necessarily know how to create the image of a most valuable player in that environment, even though Jason Tatum is playing like a top 5 MVP candidate right now. And I just feel like he's not one of those players who'll be swayed by winning the big awards. He just wants championships on his resume. And yes, it might be something that might lead to some pundits and skeptics saying like, oh, he may not be one of the all-time great players because he didn't prove he was the most valuable player. But that's not his MO. That's not the Celtics team MO. Because I feel like the Celtics are trying to implement a game plan beyond the NBA, where superstars kind of dominate headlines. They're trying to create a mentality that teams win championships. And while Jason Tatum's proven to be the best player on this team, it's not like he's doing it at the detriment of everyone else, kind of like carrying the load, whereas some other players on this list kind of are. And as a result, look more attractive in terms of their MVP candidacy. But that does not mean that Jason Tatum does not deserve to be in the top 5 for this MVP race, because he certainly has been playing like one. It's just that I don't think he can win in this team-heavy environment there in Boston. So he sits at number 5. Then let's talk about Luka Doncic, someone who hasn't necessarily played that much this season. We're going to miss the next month because of a calf strain, so it's definitely going to impact the quote-unquote games requirement for his MVP candidacy, plus 750. But I still think he's someone who has a similar stats to Tatum, doing it on a Mavericks team that's kind of seen a little bit of a decline in terms of how they played in the postseason last year, getting to the NBA Finals. But I do feel like Luka is the ultimate heartbeat of that Mavs team. They're really going to struggle without him this next month. 28.8, 8.5, 8.1 stat line, 46.2% shooting from the field for Luka. But I feel like, one, the game's requirement is going to come back to bite him for how long he misses because of this calf strain. And two, this Mavs team just has really regressed the mean. I feel like they didn't get back to what they did best, which was play defense, rely on their 6-man rotation, and ultimately rely on the pick and roll between Luka and Kyrie, creating mismatches in that regard. And Luka has been playing a little bit too much hero ball this season. And now that he's hurt, and this Mavs team has to stare at itself in the face and really decide how they're going to look moving forward in this next month and trying to stay afloat in that Western Conference playoff picture, I think that Luka certainly is going to have a lot to do to A, get this team back in contention, and B, bolster his own MVP candidacy if he should still have a viable case in terms of, like I said, the game requirement, because that always has to come back at some point. But still, Luka Doncic is an incredible player, and I still think the Mavs, much like last year, could have a second half surge that sees Luka Doncic play some of his best basketball and see this Mavericks team get back into postseason contention. So that could really help him, but right now he's at a disadvantaged position where he is missing a month. His team is most likely going to decline because of it, and once he comes back, we're going to have a mountain to climb to get back into postseason consideration, which will make his MVP case a lot more appealing. So that's why he sits at number 4 right now in these rankings. And the number 3 player, according to Vegas, Giannis at plus 500 in terms of his odds. 32.7, 11.6, 6.6, 61.3% shooting from field goal for Giannis this season in terms of his stat lines. So very impressive stat lines from one of the best two-way players in the NBA. But the problem here is he also, much like Luka Doncic, is fighting for his postseason life, but this time with a fully healthy Bucks roster. And I just think this this reason for this Bucks decline down the Eastern Conference standings is because this roster is aging. Think about it. They brought in Damian Lillard, an older point guard. Brook Lopez is still there, an older center. Bobby Portis is still there, an older sixth man. So ultimately, this older Eastern Conference team has to keep up with the young Bucks of the Celtics, the Knicks, all these young teams, the Cavs even, still pretty young team. So that's why I feel like they're slowly sliding down the rankings here. But Giannis's play has really kept them afloat. And I think that the key to A, this Bucks team's success this year, and B, Giannis' success in terms of trying to compete for this MVP award, his second, I believe, of his career, will be his companionship with Damian Lillard. I feel like if both of them can get going and both of them can kind of coalesce in a way that allows both of them to bring out the best of their games, then that complementary style of basketball can prove appealing to voters in terms of Giannis's reactionary approach to trying to help this basketball team. Because right now it's a little bit too Giannis-centric still. I feel like we haven't seen the best of Damian Lillard, and while I don't necessarily think he's the best fit offensively for the Bucks, he still is their best floor stretcher. He still is kind of the point general of this team. And if Giannis can't recognize that sometimes Damian Lillard needs space to breathe, then that could be to a detriment to both the Bucks' postseason hopes and his MVP hope, because sometimes playing as a tandem really can appeal to voters and will show that Giannis isn't just a one-man show and he's willing to sacrifice for the benefit of his team. So that's why I feel like in the second half, look for Giannis and Damian Lillard to try to get right, and look for this Bucks team who were kind of mired in mediocrity in terms of the standings, kind of barely hanging on in the play-in picture after embarrassing loss to the Nets last night, still have to, find a way. And it all starts with Giannis' relationship with Damian Lillard on the court. So that's what I think stands in his way in terms of his MVP candidacy. Then let's get into the top two here. Starting off at number 2 at plus 250, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Let's talk about this young man. What an impressive young point guard we have in the NBA here, playing for an OKC team that could look to be the next great NBA dynasty. This is a young team, perhaps still the youngest team in the NBA, and I still think that this team has not even reached its ceiling yet. I think that both sides of the floor, they feel like they can improve, whether it be through player development, whether it be through kind of this SGA Chet Holmgren pick and roll game. There's a lot of eye candy with this offense, and Shai is the ultimate leader of it. And I feel like he can be the closest to usurping Jokic, and I feel like he's almost right there. But I still think that this OKC Thunder team might be a little bit disrespected by some pundits in terms of its youth. And I still think that a lot of these teams a lot of teams and pundits don't even realize how good the Thunder can become. Because I truly don't believe they reached their precipice. Yes, this team can be capable of winning 5 championships at the least in the next decade if they reach their ceiling. And SGA is the heartbeat of all of that. He is what makes this team tick offensively and defensively. Because of his play on the point guard position, he can be someone who is in this race for many years to come. But until then, he's not beating the number one, the Joker, the best card in the deck, Nikola Jokic, a plus 110. Pretty hefty divide between him and SGA, but still, 30.9, 12.5, 9.7, had 90 fantasy points and a triple-double on New Year's Eve, for God's sakes. That's the guy we're talking about here. And until someone can prove that they're better than him, then they're going to be staring up at him for a long time. Yes, his team is not necessarily helping his case. Yes, the fact that he might only just have the one championship to fall back on, it will come back to bite him in the future. But for now, he's the best, most valuable player in the NBA, because without him, look at where the Denver Nuggets might reportedly be. They might not even be a play-in team without Nikola Jokic. That's the importance and value of Nikola Jokic to this Denver Nuggets organization. Without him, I don't know where they would be. That's why he remains the number one player. But that will just about conclude today's show. Thank you all for tuning in. I've been Christopher Shepard. We'll be getting back to regularly scheduled programming next week, so see you Monday, 3:30 Eastern, this time for a live show. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network. Make yourselves available to when we get back to live streaming. The Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. But other than that, thank you all for tuning in to today's show. I am out. We'll see you next week.